Good morning. It's a blessing to be able to come into this place and worship God and love on each other. Today is the last day, I think this is the last time we'll be looking specifically at widow stories in our Bibles, but I will admit, after saying that and writing my sermon, I was like, you know what? I'm missing one. So we'll say for now, this is the last one we'll be looking specifically at in our Bibles. We looked and have been looking at the parable of the relentlessly righteous widow. And last week, John read the story for us. We're not going to read it again this morning. We've looked at mistreated Hagar, the one whom God saw. We studied the story of righteous Rizpah, widow of King Saul and protector of the slain. We even looked at the widow of Zelophehad and her 5 daughters. Each of these stories has a common theme or a common element. Each person finds themselves fighting or fleeing. The widow of the parable, she was a fighter. She had a relentless thirst and hunger to see justice done. Neither hunger for food nor desire for sleep deterred her from her passionate plea for justice. Day and night she stood and demanded justice. And in the end, as we say, the squeaky wheel got the grease. Hagar made a run for it, if you remember. Her master Sarah saw that Hagar was starting to think that maybe she was more than just a slave. Hagar had that look in her eye that perhaps she actually was a somebody after all. Perhaps she was worthy of love and attention. And Sarah would not have it. Sarah mistreated her Egyptian slave just as the Egyptian taskmasters would one day later do to the descendants of Sarah. Hagar flees, but God sees. God sees her. God makes a promise to her. She is safe. We looked at Rizpah, former wife of King Saul. The new King David had formed an agreement with the Gibeonites. A famine had been ravaging the land of Israel for 3 years. King Saul was to blame, but King Saul is dead. So now who do you punish? So the Gibeonites asked for all the descendants of Saul to be killed, impaled on poles in the presence of God. All but one of Saul's lineage had been put to death. And it is there, surrounded by her slain family, righteous widow Rizpah makes her stand. She sleeps on sackcloth laid over her bed of stones. She chases away both bird and beast, trying to honor the horrific slaughter. Her sons have suffered. And for 6 months, she suffers alone. Her husband is dead. Her sons are dead. Her stepsons are dead. Her step-grandchildren are dead. And they've all been left to decay, exposed on poles to earth's harsh elements. And no one seems to care. Even the bones of her deceased husband, Saul, and his son, Jonathan, David's best friend, remain improperly buried for at least 3 years. No one seems to care about Rizpah. She had to suffer for the sake of righteousness. She hungered and she thirsted for it. After hearing these stories, if I've so cleverly summarized for you all, one might fall into despair. Why is justice so hard to find? Why are so many leaders like the unjust judge unwilling to bend toward justice and love? Why must we suffer for the sake of righteousness? Indeed, it is easy to feel this way. When we pick up our Old Testaments, and we see how the law was designed to protect and care for the most vulnerable, we often wonder, how could it be so bad? How could things have gotten so bad and so many would have to suffer needlessly? If they love the law of God, wouldn't there already be solutions to these harsh realities of life? Why does every story require a fight? Well, not every story does. Not every widow story ends with harsh treatment or widows standing surrounded by their slain family or a widow looking for a judge who actually cares. In fact, our final story, if it is the final one, has no antagonists, no bad guys, just bad circumstances. And in this story we're about to consider, there is no fighting, begging, fleeing, or pleading. In this story, we immediately happen upon a just judge. A judge who loves God and respects people. A judge who loves the perfect law of God, and on this law he does meditate both day and night. He is a worthy man, and he meets a worthy widow. Anyone want to venture a guess? What story are we going to look at? Yeah, it's Ruth. It's the story of Ruth that we will look at today. And with any luck, we'll finish it today. And if you know me, that's quite an undertaking. The story begins in difficult times. And you'll notice as we read through parts of the story, it's going to sound very familiar, parts of it. The story begins in difficult times. There's a famine in the land of Judah. A man named Elimelech takes his wife, Naomi, and his 2 sons, and they move to Moab. Now, make no mistake, this is absolutely a strange move to make. The Moabites are the sworn enemy of Judah. Any of Moab that happen to be in Judah are not permitted to worship with the Israelites, and they are not permitted to marry any Moabites. Strictly forbidden. The Moabites are a cursed people, cursed from their inception. The book of Genesis tells us that the Moabites are the direct result of an incestual relationship between Lot and one of his daughters. Now, Lot is the nephew of Abraham, just in case you're like, Lot, nephew of Abraham. The Moabites are the direct result of an incestual relationship when they thought they were the only ones left on earth. The backstory of the Moabites is an unpleasant one. And the restriction against worshiping with them is there, and marrying them is strictly forbidden. Not to be done ever. But it is to this land that Elimelech, whose name means God is my king, so a guy whose name is God is my king, moves to the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. They spend 10 years in the land of Moab. Now, I've been here 9 years, so we know how fast 10 years can go by. They spend 10 years in the land of Moab. His sons, of course, what do they think they do? They marry. Who do you think they marry? Moabites. Oh, man. Sons go and they marry Moabite women, and life is good, actually. But then Elimelech dies. Then his 2 sons also die. And in the wake of their deaths, we find our 3 widows. Sweet Naomi, her widowed daughter-in-law Orpah, and faithful Ruth. After her husband and sons have passed, Naomi hears that God is blessing her homeland of Judah with rain and grain, and so she decides to go back, but go back alone. Orpah, at Naomi's bidding, returns to her people in Moab. Ruth, however, has made up her mind. She will return with Naomi. She says, and this is probably the most well-known part of all of Ruth. You'll hear it read at weddings. So it's strange that it's actually a daughter-in-law speaking to her mother-in-law. Ruth says to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Ruth isn't going anywhere. Wherever Naomi goes, Ruth is going to go, and they're going to Judah, a Moabite in Judah. Upon their arrival, they are not greeted as you might expect them to be. And any other widow story might see some drama begin here. But no one, not a single person, accuses Naomi of idolatry. No one. No one belittles her for her decade-long stay in Moab, the land of incest and disgust. No one quotes Bible at her, telling her that Elimelech and her 2 sons died because they associated with Moabites, even marrying them. No one declares, according to Deuteronomy 23, that they had called down a curse for their blatant disregard for the law. And trust me, there are multiple passages people could have utilized to make these points. But no one does. In fact, no one even hints that these sacred verses even exist. Not in the book of Ruth. No, the story does not go as one might expect it to go. And I imagine those who first heard the story thousands of years ago were taken aback by the parts of the story that were missing from Ruth. I mean, where are all the accusations? They should be there somewhere. But there is no prophet proclaiming the sins of this family. There's no condemnation as one might anticipate. This is in part why Ruth persists and exists. These 2 widows are welcomed immediately. They are greeted at the entrance to the city with joy and perhaps a little confusion because Naomi had left filled with a husband and 2 sons, but she has returned to them empty, with neither husband nor sons. They speak to one another, the women of the town, they speak to one another and to Naomi, and they say, "Can this be Naomi the sweet?" Now, if you're following along, you might be, "Naomi the sweet? Where'd that come from?" That's what the name Naomi means. Sweet one. Can this be Naomi the sweet? "Do not call me Naomi the sweet," she told them. "Call me Mara the bitter, because Shaddai has made my life bitter." Our widow, like Job, has experienced a grief that few can even comprehend. But our empty, bitter, and afflicted Naomi has returned to Judah in hopes of being filled. And faithful Ruth is by her side, loyal and unwavering in her love for her mother-in-law. By chapter 2, Ruth, the Moabite, the forbidden one, is seen harvesting in the fields of Judah. The law of God may have forbidden her due to her nationality and ethnicity, but in other verses, the law protects individuals just like her. Like Naomi, the Moabite Ruth is immediately welcomed in the fields. Her reputation as a faithful friend to Naomi has preceded her. One can picture Ruth there. Now just use your imagination. One can picture Ruth there. She's in a field that is finely full of flowing barley, pushed to and fro by gentle breezes. If you listen carefully, you can hear the braying of sheep in the distance. The other workers can be heard singing the psalms of God as they gather their grain. The morning sun is just starting to warm the earth as she gathers her daily bread in the brief morning fog. It is picturesque. It's perfect. But let us not forget, all the while, Ruth is wearing her Moabite clothing. She is speaking broken Hebrew with her Moabite accent, greeting passerbys with a mispronounced shalom, as only a Moabite would have done. She is doing life in Judah as a Moabite. It's who she is. And yet, she is welcomed. She is accepted, no questions asked, no condemning verses shared, no recollections or remembrances of just where the Moabites came from are hurled her way. No, Ruth is cared for. And as she works tirelessly in the field, gathering for herself and Naomi, the owner of the field arrives. So those of you who are familiar with the book of Ruth, you know this is an ancient love story. The owner of the field arrives. It's the love interest. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. Listen to how idyllic this is. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. This may seem a small thing, but yet it is another detail as to just how little drama this story actually has. It is idyllic in every way. The women love Naomi. The workers accept our Moabite widow. And the workers are happy in the fields, greeting their boss, and the boss is greeting them with blessings of God's continued presence. Boaz asked the overseers of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" Smooth, Boaz, real smooth. Of course, we knew this was coming, right? A new woman has shown up in his fields, in the fields of Boaz. And Boaz, he notices Ruth's otherness was not a hindrance. Her Moabite attire causes him to pick up more grain, not pick up stones. The strange tune she may have been humming as she worked may have tickled his ears. We don't know. But there was something about this widow that Boaz liked. And as men do, we're not always so brave. We inquire of someone else. He makes an inquiry. In today's words, he asks, "Is she spoken for?" I don't want to go any further. I'm going to protect my heart and my ego. I'm not going to go any further to find out she's already promised herself to somebody else. The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came from Moab." You may not know this, but that's where all Moabites come from. All of them come from Moab. She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. The story of Ruth has multiple moments when it could have turned very ugly. Times when our widow heroines could have been rejected and stoned, abused and belittled, rejected and ridiculed. But as we have already seen, the book of Ruth seeks to tell a different tale. One that doesn't leave its listeners mourning and angry. A story that centers around a community and a man who are bent on justice instead of judgment, bent on grace instead of graves, bent toward love instead of loathing. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field. Don't go glean in any other man's field. Stay in my field. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Ruth recognizes the overflowing and abounding bounty of Boaz. In case we, the readers, have forgotten, we are yet again reminded that she is a foreigner, and not just any foreigner, she is a Moabite woman. Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and have come to live with the people you did not know before." Side note, we can hear echoes of Genesis in this verse. A man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, but Ruth has left her father and mother and has clinged to her mother-in-law. Abraham left a land that he grew up in to go to the God's promised land, a place that he did not know. And Ruth has left her homeland to to go to God's promised land, a land that she did not know, a land of rest and a land of provision. May the Lord repay you for what you have done, Boaz continues. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Boaz is not dismayed at hearing she is a foreigner. Her Moabite heritage is no obstacle for him. Just as God saw Hagar, Boaz sees Ruth. Her husband has died. Her brother-in-law has died. Her father-in-law, too, is gone. And Ruth followed her heart all the way to Judah. And the wings of God have given her refuge in that place. If we had been reading the story verse by verse, we would have noticed a detail that I have not yet mentioned. Some of you are probably already thinking about it. Boaz is a guardian redeemer, a kinsman redeemer for Ruth. I'll explain what that is in just a second. He doesn't know it yet, and Ruth doesn't know it yet, but the reader does. God is with Ruth. However, we have a problem. It's a major roadblock. Though Boaz is a guardian redeemer, the one who's supposed to take Ruth as his wife, care for her, love her, provide her with children, he's supposed to do all those things, but she is a Moabite. This is a roadblock. She is a Moabite. As we stated before, marriage to a Moabite is strictly forbidden by the law. The law does not provide a caveat. There are no loopholes. The law makes no exceptions. You shall not marry a Moabite woman. However, caring for widows and family is commanded by the law. If there is a widow among you, she is to be cared for, protected, fed, and loved. So I have a question. You ready? What do we do when laws run contrary to one another? What is the prescribed procedure when laws are diametrically opposed to one another? You cannot fulfill your duty to care for the widow and marry her and give her children when the widow is a Moabite. Or can you? You cannot marry her, start a family, save her dead husband's name and legacy when she has been declared off limits. So what do you do? What we will see is that Boaz will do exactly what we saw Moses do last week. Like, oh, what did Moses do last week? I'll refresh your memories. It's online too. The 5 daughters of Zelophehad experienced the blessed flexibility of the law, and so shall Ruth. Remember the 5 daughters of Zelophehad, they weren't supposed to inherit land because that's only supposed to go to sons and not daughters, but they don't have any husbands and there were no sons and their father is dead. Remember the story? And Moses said, you know what? Actually, we're going to let the law bend to you. Actually, God says the law is going to bend toward you. You see, the law that offers grace supersedes the law that condemns, and Boaz will bend toward grace and love. Ruth stays in the fields of Boaz through both the barley and the wheat harvest, which is approximately 4 months long. You may recall that Rizpah suffered for the sake of righteousness for 6 long months, but not all stories require loss and pain. Some stories are filled with good judges, just judges, who do what is right from day one. Ruth spends 4 long months being blessed by the faithfulness of Boaz. This is where the story gets a little strange. We won't cover the strangeness, but just know it's there. Ruth, at the request of Naomi, seeks out Boaz in the middle of the night. She puts on her best clothes, puts on her best perfume, and goes to visit Boaz in the middle of the night. Any other story may have ended with adultery and a good stoning, but not this story. No, here Ruth reveals to Boaz that he is her guardian. Sworn by the law of God to protect her, the law promised her protection. And she had gone to see if Boaz would be willing to fulfill that promise. She went to see if he would be faithful to the call of God on his life, or would he begin to make excuses like those who were invited to the master's banquet? Would he play nice by quoting Deuteronomy 23, pretending to be faithful to the law, but knowing that deep down he simply wants nothing to do with a nasty, born of incest Moabite? Remember, God had given her refuge under his wing. But would Boaz? There's also an interesting detail that is often overlooked by readers of Ruth. Boaz admits that he is much older than Ruth. He states that Ruth could have gone after any of the young men who worked in his fields, but instead she chose him. Unlike Hagar, who was forced to be with a much older man, Ruth has chosen Boaz. A woman has chosen a man. Another twist in our already strange story. As chapter 3 ends, we find out that Boaz is not a man who pretends to love God but disrespect people. He sends Ruth away, back to her home with Naomi, in the cover of morning darkness so no one knows that she was there. He again gives her food and provisions, telling her that Naomi, who had returned empty, must be filled. And as the chapter concludes, we discover that there is yet another problem. A problem other than her being a Moabite. There is another problem. A problem that even a noble man like Boaz, who is bent on showing mercy and love, cannot ignore. You see, there is another man. Sounds like a romance novel. Another man. He needs to shave. It's been a couple days. He wears flannel. There's another man who is more closely related to Naomi than Boaz. And this man gets the first opportunity to provide and care for Ruth. It's obviously the story that Boaz loves Ruth. But will he just walk away, throw up his hands in despair, and proclaim, "What do you want me to do?" He gets first dibs. And besides, what good romance story wouldn't have some sort of obstacle to love? Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. So he goes to the city gate, he sits down, and there comes the other guy in his flannel shirt and slightly unshaven face. He owns a Christmas tree farm. No, okay. Let me start all over. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here." And they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of my elders, of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. And just when it seems our forbidden love between Moabite and Judahite will never come to pass, when it seems that Boaz must hand her to another, he follows up with another important detail, one our guardian redeemer did not know. Then Boaz said, "Oh, by the way, on the day that you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." In other words, you might not actually get this field. And in fact, it might actually put in jeopardy some of your other fields. At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." And just like that, justice was done. The widow Ruth doesn't have to beg and plead day after day and night after night, wishing someone would care. She isn't forced to go on the run, pregnant with her master's child. She doesn't spend 6 months suffering physical and emotional trauma as Rizpah had done in search of someone who might actually care. Ruth found Boaz, and Boaz has found Ruth. Our lovely little story ends as you might have now come to expect. An epic love story that ends in marriage, like a Mexican novela, que siempre termina en boda, right? Always ends in a wedding. The whole town is delighted and celebrates the union of this Judahite man and this Moabite woman. And at the very end of the book, it is revealed why the story is even being told. When you preach a sermon like this, it's hard to know where to start. Could have started here and worked our way backwards. At the end of the book, it tells us why the story is even being told. What would be the point of telling such a strange love story? So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he had made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, the whole town's there, they're all participating. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son." It's a strange story. I thought Ruth had a son, but she does. Naomi too. Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Somehow, some way, a forbidden Moabite woman has become the great-grandmother of King David. The story of Ruth became extremely well known and liked during the time of Israel's history when foreign wives of Israelite men were being forced to leave the land of Judah. They were being driven out into the wilderness like Hagar, taking their children with them. Read Ezra and Nehemiah. Ruth may have been set during the time of the judges, but her story rose to the occasion during the time after the Babylonian exile. When Israel's leaders were demanding families to be separated, wives and children to be torn from their Israelite husbands, someone took the time to remind the people of the story of Ruth. A story where a man was able to look beyond the letter of the law, see the heart of God, and act accordingly. It's a story without bad guys. It's no bloodshed, no hatred. A story where the worst thing that happens is a man fears for his own fields. And yet its message lives on. And it is a challenge of paramount importance, wrapped in a love story that warms the heart. Will we learn the lesson? Will we too choose love over letter? For Boaz, the choice was simple. He didn't even have to think twice about it. He knew what was right. He chose what was right. Will we be Boaz?